Hi, and welcome to session 3 of our series, Jesus, God with Us, where we open up the book of Matthew, the Gospel according to Matthew. Today, we will be building actually on the last session, which talked about Jesus goes public. And we look at the things that Jesus did out in the public, I guess, what things that people could see that he did, but also the things that he said. So the public sermons that he gave. Today, we actually take an insider look at Jesus. We look at his inner life, his conversations that he has, the things he does with the disciples. And so I'm hoping that you have read in advance the pre-reading for today, which is Matthew 16:21 all the way to Matthew 18:35. All right? And our key verse for today out of that whole block is Matthew 16, verse 21, and it goes like this. From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. Now, for us, reading that, where Jesus is explaining just to his private disciples, for us reading this and hearing Jesus say, oh yeah, he must suffer, he must go on the cross, he must be ridiculed, he must die, right? And then on the third day, he must be raised. For us, this is like, of course, we know Jesus must do this. We know that this has actually happened. But you have to understand that the context where Jesus is saying this, it was mind-blowing to them because there were very different expectations of what a Messiah would be, who Jesus would be. In Matthew 16, verse 15, we hear Jesus ask a very essential question to his disciples. He says, "Who do you say I am?" Was he a new Moses, a new greater than Moses? And so Moses is one of these big themes that you could look at the book of Matthew and see parallels between Jesus and Moses. That's why we talk about the Passover meal and the Passover when Jesus sort of gets betrayed and crucified. It also is a little bit like Moses in that he gets tempted in the wilderness, he goes and he redeems his people, and so is Jesus, a kind of Moses? Or is Jesus like some of the Pharisees, or even, I guess, some of his disciples, even Peter maybe, would think Jesus is this victorious Messiah, that Jesus has come, he has done all these miracles, he's like, oh my goodness, fulfillment of all this prophecy in the Old Testament, and he is going to save us, like what Psalms 2 talks about, like what Daniel 2 talks about. He's going to conquer Rome, he's going to overturn, Israel is not going to be under submission and slavery anymore, but Jesus is going to be this ultimate lion, this Lion of Judah, this king who conquers it all. Is that Jesus? Or would Jesus be the suffering servant that is talked about in Isaiah 53, who suffers on our behalf, and by his stripes we get healed? And Jesus would go and very carefully explain to his disciples. So we're looking at Jesus in his private ministry, his private explanations to his disciples. He would explain why he does the things he does, because he is actually going to be the propitiation of our sins, the payment for our sins. In the fourth discourse, so the fourth big sermon in Matthew, he teaches his disciples how they should relate to one another. So he's talking a little bit about this inner life, right? It's this Jesus' private ministry. He talks about how we should relate, what it is to be truly great. Then he talks about not being a stumbling block, Then he talks about how we should have pastoral concern for each other. Then he talks about how we should relate to one another if one of our brothers or sisters sins against us. And then he talks about why we need to forgive. All these things about how we should then be a bit of a servant to others. Why does Jesus talk about that? He talks about that because he himself is going to walk this path. He's going to himself show true greatness, not by being the first, but by humbling himself down. He himself is not going to be a stumbling block to others, so that people will look at the life of Jesus and go, oh my goodness, that is the life we should have lived. He himself will have pastoral concern. He himself will forgive others who would sin against him, who would eventually kill him even. And so I'm hoping that as you take a look at our passages today, that you would see Jesus in his private life. And as we are doing this who, what, why, today we are getting to the question of why. Why does Jesus do what he does? And I hope you will discover that in understanding his why, in going inside to see his motivation, that you would see the heart of a God who loves us, a God who is humble and loving and gracious, who would suffer death on a cross even for people who have sinned, so that he could be raised and get victory over things that we ourselves have never had victory over. I hope it's a good study for you, and that you would take the time to explore why Jesus does what he does. God bless.